We are studying Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Kena Upanishad and the chapter titled The Eternal Beyond the Mind, where Sri Aurobindo elaborates on the relationship between the Brahman and the mind as the Kena Upanishad leads us to through its first few verses. Sri Aurobindo points out that mind, life, sense and speech, these are not utter Brahman, they are only inferior modes and external instruments. The Brahman consciousness, which is what missions the mind to reach its mark, which is what moves the life breath, which impels the word, which sets eyes and ears to their working, this Brahman consciousness is our real self and our true existence. This being the first paragraph we read last time, a series of stages by which Sri Aurobindo leads us to the recognition of what in us is not Brahman and what is. Through these layers, we go as if through a kind of an introspection. These series of stages can be seen both philosophically, understanding why this is not Brahman, but they can also be seen experientially and practically in a form of an introspective meditation, where we disengage ourselves from each of these layers successively until we come to something which is on the border, an essentiality which is on the border through which we break through into an experience of the self. So the first of these which he has disengaged from, he says, mind and body are not our real self. They are mutable formations or images which we go on constructing in the drive of time as a result of the mass of our past energies. And we saw how deep this description goes as the mass of energies that stream through across time, of which we are the current focal point as a transitional product, and the same energies go on moving. At the level of the body, it is the form which we seize upon and say, this is I, but that also is a part of a continuous flux of change. At the level of the mind, we catch a certain pattern of ideas, a limited representation, and we say, this is I, but that, Sri Aurobindo says, is only an image and a part of a larger image and a transitional image, and so mind and body are not our real self. Behind that, we have the ego function, which we consider our real self. This sense that I am separate, I exist, I am not all these things which are the universe. He says even this is a faculty put forward by the discriminating mind to centralize around itself the experiences of the sense mind. And again, we discussed this last time. This also we can disengage from. And then there is the memory. The memory which carries the sense of continuity. And even this, he says, is not our real self. It is a selective instrument for the practical management of our conscious activities and which allow for an organized and spacious enjoyment. As we saw last time, that it allows us to put in reference of the current experience of life, all the past experiences of different time and space, and gives us a wider canvas on which to enjoy and appreciate the moment. But still, other than maintaining the sense of continuity of the ego sense, memory is not ourselves. Behind that, the moral personality, this is the person that we feel we are, which carries the imprint of the highest values of our personality. And even this, he says, is a pliable mold which allows only some appearance of fixity in what is otherwise a constantly mutable becoming. And finally, behind that, he says, the totality of our mutable conscious becoming, even that is not us. And this totality we saw spanning across time, across space, because it is something which appears almost complete and appears constant. It is possible to say, this is I, and even that he says is only, and he gives us three images which we dwelt on last time. What we become is a fluent mass of life, a stream of experience pouring through time, a flux of nature upon the crest of which our mentality rides. And we dwelt last time on these three images and saw how these are representations of something much deeper. In these three images, you see a flow. The first is only this fluent mass of life, a flowing mass across space, across time. In the second experience, in the second image, it is a stream of experiences. It's not just this mass of form. It is the experiences which we have gathered, which we have developed, which make us what we are, which is being described in a continuity through time. And finally, a flux of nature upon the crest of which our mentality rides. It is a kind of a stream of continuity of consciousness of the mentality, which rides on this changing flow, and that could also appear to be as if a center of our true nature, but it is not. He says, what we are in the eternal essence, what we are is the eternal essence of that life, the immutable consciousness that bears the experience, the immortal substance of nature and mentality. So we saw how these three represent the three facets of the Satchidananda, the existence which holds the eternal essence of life, the consciousness which bears the experience, and then the immortal substance of nature and mentality. All of these three representing three facets of the Satchidananda, and therefore these three images are each a theme of meditation, not only to be observed in a philosophical appreciation and understanding, but something which we can introspectively discover in ourselves. And what we would have to do for that, when we observe the flow of our life, we stand back from it and we say, here is this person, here is this life. The personality took birth in that little lump of tissue, which was a baby. It ate food and absorbed material from the universe to make its body larger. It absorbed experiences through the life and the senses and made its mentality wider, more mature. And that continuing as part of a larger flow is this personality that I identify with, which will continue further. Eventually, it will even shed the form of this body, pick up a new form, and so on continue. And in this introspection, we disengage from the flowing mass and try to observe what in it is permanent, what is the eternal essence of that life. And we can see it as a third person, or we can turn within and try to feel what is it that has carried the continuity, the thread of continuity since I was a little baby, and which gives me the sense of the continuity of life as the same person. It's not the way I think which has changed. It's not the form of the body which has changed. There's a kind of an essential awareness which I identify with, which is not the memory sense as we have already seen. It is not the personality, but something more essential. And I am able, as if through an introspection, to come to something which is indescribable, which maintains the sense of continuity across the life. Using the second image, again, we have a similar introspective experience when he says, we are the immutable consciousness that bears the experience. And what is the nature of that experience? A stream of experience pouring through time. So here the focus of our observation is all the things which are happening to us. We wake up in the morning, We look at things, we walk around, we meet people, we are drawn to do certain things, and through it all, we are experiencing things, enjoying those experiences, but who is experiencing? Who is enjoying? And when we begin to introspect in this way, we disengage from the experiences themselves and come to some kind of an essential consciousness which observes the experience, reflects the experience, and even draws a kind of an essential enjoyment from that experience. Not the consciousness which is immersed in the experience, but a consciousness that stands back. And in observing, in appreciating all that we go through, it draws some kind of a deep, quiet, detached joy. Even when the surface personality suffers a painful life experience, this part inside says, this was interesting. I've never experienced this before. This has some learning, some element of learning also. And this part of us, which he describes as the immutable consciousness that bears the experience, it carries, it holds that stream of experience that is closer to us. And it is through that we find a gateway to recover our true sense of self outside even the domain of the experience. And the third meditation is to dwell on this image, the immortal substance of nature and mentality, which is our true self and not the flux of nature upon which our mentality rides. So we try to feel what in us could be described as a substance that is immortal. Obviously, the body is constantly rebuilt from the material, the food that we eat. Our mind is recast from the ideas and imprints that come through the universe. But what is there which we could describe as an essential substance? And this is a more difficult experience to discover, but still there is something which we can touch. And now, looking at these three, I want to bring it in the context of the integral yoga, where the focus is not so much on the self, but the self through the psychic being. And you will notice all three descriptions of what he says we are equally applicable to the self as to the psychic being. So when he says we are the eternal, what we are is the eternal essence of that life. It is the psychic being which carries the thread of the journey of life across lives, across time. It is that part of us that is immortal. But even as that is immortal, there is the self behind supporting, which holds the whole stream of the journey, which holds the sense of purpose and the direction of unfolding of that stream across lives, across time. And so you can see how the description applies to both. The second description, what we are is the immutable consciousness that bears the experience. And the secret enjoyer of all these experiences, the one who grows through it all, through pain, through suffering, through joys, through happinesses, equally, is still the psychic being, and behind that, supporting it, the wider, freer self. And finally, this last description, what we are is the immortal substance of nature and mentality. It is here that the character of the psychic being comes forward most intensely. The immortal substance is not only the self that supports all this flow of energy, which is nature, but equally the part of the self that enters the flow, but retains still the character of divinity. And this is substance of divinity in life. It is this which the mother valued so much in its vibration, in all that we do in life. This can be experienced as a substance, as a vibration which is substantial, which can fill the body, fill our life energies, even fill our mind. And it is this substance which becomes more and more dense, which concretizes eventually to become the new body of what Sri Aurobindo has described as the supramental being. So the descriptions here are not only accurate in the conventional Vedantic understanding, but they also point to a deeper truth of the integral yoga when we go through a kind of an introspection to recognize ourselves as being these three things. And always we find we are first centered in the form and substance of the psychic being, and then behind that, the form and substance, or formlessness and eternal substantiality of the self. So we reread these lines to enjoy, to complete our appreciation and enjoyment of what he is saying. What we become is a fluent mass of life, a stream of experience pouring through time, a flux of nature upon the crest of which our mentality rides. What we are is the eternal essence of that life, the immutable consciousness that bears the experience, the immortal substance of nature and mentality. This is our true identity. And it is the relationship between what we become and what we are, which now becomes the focus of Sri Aurobindo's elaboration. He says, for behind all and dominating all that we become and experience, there is something that originates, uses, determines, enjoys, yet is not changed by its origination, not affected by its instruments, not determined by its determinations, not worked upon by its enjoyings. What that is, we cannot know unless we go behind the veil of our mental being, which knows only what is affected, what is determined, what is worked upon, what is changed. And so this is the relationship. And again, the way he describes it, not only can we see it philosophically, but we can also pursue this in an introspective, meditative concentration to actually experience something of this and eventually realize it. So he describes it using four terms. Behind all that we become and experience, there is something which originates, uses, determines, enjoys. And against each of these four terms, we see it is not changed by its origination, not affected by its instruments, not determined by its determinations, not worked upon by its enjoyings. So each of these four form as if a passage, a gateway in our introspective meditation. Each of these four is a kind of a entry point from the becoming to the essential being behind. These are four relationships which hold the two together. The first is the relationship of origination. It is the self which originates nature and our mentality. It is the origin. It originates, that is, it puts out, it creates out of itself, but is not changed by its origination. Now, if we observe the nature of our world as we experience it, whenever something originates something else, in the very act of originating, it is changed. a human being gives birth to a child. In the act of giving birth, the human being undergoes an enormous internal change, and in the final act of the birth, there is a separation, a part that is thrown out, a part that is lost, an emptiness left, a feeling of incompleteness, loss. But this is the case with everything, sometimes more subtle, sometimes more obvious. When an artist creates something new, in the very act of creation, he pours himself out and then collapses in exhaustion when the process is complete. Because his energies have been thrown out, even if the creation is made of material other than himself. But his energies still have to be thrown out. Or when I have not put out as much of my energy, I have put out only an idea, and the idea that I have put out now is applied by others. I do not have either the loss of my own substance, I do not have the loss of my own energy, but I have an attachment to that idea. This is my idea. And in order not to, for somebody else to use, misuse, or otherwise utilize that idea, I must bind myself to it, I must patent it, copyright it, register it as mine. And thereafter, I have to spend my energies to keep my sense of possession. Whenever somebody uses that idea, I find I am used, I am attached, I am connected, dragged in. And somehow it pulls me and changes me. So you will find in the way things work in our formed universe, everywhere that there is an origination, there is something which is lost, and in the act of origination, something is modified. The originator does not remain the same. But here he says that which originates is not changed by its origination. And what is it originating? The entire universe. That humongous energy of the Big Bang, which is released, out of which all this has formed, that is still what it was, unchanged by its origination. There is this huge pouring out of the universal life energy, creating gigantic galaxies, solar systems, planets, mountains, civilizations. And all these are originated still from the self. It is the self which presides over the formations of all these things, unfolding in eternity of time, and yet it is unchanged by this enormous creation that is still ongoing. And how is that possible? The difference is this: in nature, all origination is part of a larger flux. But for the self, the origination is not a change, is not a movement. It is its own awareness that dwells on itself. Nothing is changed, all remains self, even while the entire universe is born out of it. The problem of the distinction is resolved when we realize that there is nothing other than the self. When the self manifests, it does not manifest into something else. It does not manifest into space or into time which is other than itself. All space, all time, all form are only itself, and therefore the manifestation takes place within itself, of its own substance, and all of that remains exactly what it was, even as it becomes all that it can be. So this is already for the mind a confounding concept. What is it that is spaceless, timeless, formless, and yet holds all space, time, form in itself? And so we have to, in our understanding, reduce all the creation into something like a dream. We use the image of a human being who is dreaming. And as he dreams, all these wonderful images and experiences are created, but the human being remains himself. And the dream is only something unsubstantial. But this is not true of the self. For the self, because it is all reality, its dream is not an unsubstantial dream, its dream is a reality equally. And so, dwelling on this, meditating on this theme, we are able now to begin to feel, recognize something deeper, not changed by its origination. And so, the first relationship of the eternal essence that we are and the becoming into which this is expressed is the relationship of origination. The second relationship he describes is usage. There is something that uses and yet is not affected by its instruments. So in the origination, it was more direct, this as if emerges out of that. But in this usage, this stands back. There are instruments working, they are there, they are not there, they change, they do what they want to do. But this behind uses them for its own purpose secretly, and sometimes they don't even know that they are being used. And this is the nature of the instrumentation. A hammer is picked up and you hit the nail with it. The hammer remains exactly what it was. It doesn't feel it has done anything, it has not even attempted to do anything. Somebody picked it up, hit the nail, and that's all. If at all the hammer could be aware, it would feel only the impact of being hit on the nail, but it would not know why or who or what end was behind it. Of course, the problem is more complex when you have living beings and conscious living beings. Human beings, driven by desire, have an awareness which registers all their desires are compelling them to. And if you were to observe a human being in his life journey, you would see this bundle of desires pulling, pushing, driving him to do things. But if you could see deeply, you would find behind it all this secret consciousness which is behind, which bears the experience. It puts out an influence. It modifies, working through those desires, it modifies the ends towards which the life goes. So, for example, I have a desire to create something great. I have a desire to become very rich, to become very powerful, to become very famous. And I struggle to fulfill that desire through my life. But in the process, what's actually happening? Perhaps I attain to the wealth or not, whether I attain to the fame or not, I grow. Something inside uses that desire and the drive of that desire to achieve a very different result. It may even modulate those desires, push them, nudge them, change their direction a few times to guide to a specific outcome that it seeks, which is the line of growth that the soul has chosen. So when I try to be famous, I try to do something and I find it doesn't work. My desire pulls me then to attempt something else and then to attempt something else. In doing one of those things, I feel a sense of satisfaction. I do not attain to the fame that I want or the wealth that I want, but I feel, this was worthwhile. And so I begin to do that a little more. But if you ask yourself, what gave you the sense of deeper satisfaction? Why is it that in doing this work, I felt more fulfilled? Because something deep inside stirred. It came forward and it said yes. And that brought a sense of a joy, a sense of completeness. I didn't choose it. My desires didn't choose it. My desires were still fixated on an object which I have not attained. Something else influenced from behind the scenes. And so this is the second relationship of the self within and the form of this flowing mass of life that it uses as an instrument all these things, mind, life, and body. But is not affected by its instruments. Unlike the experiences of the world where in the very act of using an instrument, you are bound to the instrument. Uh, an astronaut who has to wear a space suit to be able to step out into empty space is now locked in the limitations of the spacesuit. If the spacesuit is rigid, he can only move in a rigid way. If the spacesuit is heavy, he can only move slowly. In the very act of using an instrument, you become limited by the nature of the instrument. If I have a hammer and I'm required to turn a screw, well, there is no way I can turn the screw. I can only hit the screw with the hammer. I have become constrained by the instrument that I use. This is the nature of life, because in the flow of life, everything is interdependent with everything else. Everything is tied in a chain of cause and effect. In the very act of engaging with a chain, I become bound to its cause and effect. But the self, which is not bound in cause and effect, which is not bound in chains of dependence, is utterly free. It can influence, it can use without experiencing limitation of the instrument that it uses. Again, you will remember in the Isha Upanishad, the word which is used to describe how the self acts without effort, without sinews. Its influence is not a strain or an effort that reaches out, limits it, or constrains it. Because, and again, to understand, it is useful to see it this way, the self underlies everything. The self is the essential substance of everything. And so when it acts, it does not have to act against something else. Unlike an instrument which we pick up, we have to use it against something else. It is separate from us and we have to use against another. And so there's a whole chain of dependencies. The self is everything, and when it chooses to do something, everything moves, everything is modified spontaneously, effortlessly, and the outcome is made. So the second relationship of the self with the flow of the world is usage, but still it remains not affected by its instruments. The third relationship is determination. So in the usage, we saw a subtle influence modifying, guiding, directing, while the instruments do pretty much what they want according to their habit, according to their nature. The heart desires, the mind plans, and the body struggles, and they continue, and secretly the self uses. But in determination, the relationship changes. The self now asserts as the Lord. And as it asserts, it compels. And when it compels, whatever the resistance offered by circumstances, it is overcome and nothing can oppose. But normally in life, when we compel, when we determine, when we force, we ourselves are determined by the determinations. In the very act of asserting my power, I now become bound to that role of power. In the very act of becoming Prime Minister, I am now bound to the responsibilities which come with that role, and I cannot escape it. I have now to behave in a different way in the public light because I am Prime Minister, because I have taken the reins of these powers. I must now live up to what people expect me to do, and I am now a puppet in of their expectations. So we have this very wrong idea when we think of a king or a head of state. We think, oh, this person has so much power, they can do whatever they like. In fact, it's the very opposite. The moment you gain those powers, you find you're bound by the requirements that those powers give you. And it is something quite unnerving. You lose completely your own personal freedom, and you are now a toy in a complex set, a web of compulsions. The mother made this observation in relation to the conveniences of modern life when she was training Huta to draw certain lines of Savitri. And I don't remember the exact line, but where Sri Aurobindo speaks of this precisely, where he says that we become slaves of the very conveniences that we create. And the mother made Huta draw this picture of a man tied by chains to all these devices which are supposed to make his life more convenient, more free, give him more time and more comfort. We are now so dependent on those that our behavior is modified by the needs of those instruments. So, because I have a mobile phone, I must now keep looking at it. And when the mobile phone beeps, I must respond to it. And after a while, you wonder, is it my instrument or am I its instrument? It can decide when I have to wake up, it can decide when I have to take a call, and so on. It sets my schedule. So, the nature of the life flow is that in the very act of determination, you are determined in the determination that you exercise. But with the self, it determines yet is not changed by its, is not determined by its determinations. How did that happen? And again, we go back to this idea that all energy, all power is power of self. So when the self exercises itself in the universe, it works not in one spot but everywhere, because all energy is its energy without differentiation. And an action emerging from the self acts upon the whole universe. Everything in the universe changes at the same time to lead to that particular outcome. And so there is this effortless ease of its action. Let me put it another way. If you had to lift the stone, move it from here to there, the resistance of its movement is the resistance against the whole universe. Everything that exists around is tied to the stone through waves of whatever you may call gravity, electric, magnetic waves. Everything is flowing across each other and binding each other. When I move the stone, the resistance against the universe is what we call inertia. In physics, one actually measures inertia or determines inertia of an object by its relationship with the whole. So the movement, the resistance I feel in moving the stone from here to there is the resistance of the relationship with the whole which is being modified. But if all the relationships of the stone with the whole universe are simultaneously modified from within, that the relationships are redefined, instantly my stone will not be here, it will be there. And this is how the self acts. When it acts upon all the relationships, all the energies of the whole universe, and simply changes them because they are nothing but its own free will, free choice. And so the result is there, and it seems miraculous, effortless. When an exercise of this kind of freedom is made, it seems to bypass what we call the laws of nature, the habits of nature, the conventional ways and flows by which things happen. And so we are surprised and we say, this is a miracle. But to the experience of the self, it is nothing but a free exercise of its choice, of its will, as free as the freedom in which it cast out the universe. There's no difference. From moment to moment, it is as if the self creates, supports, or recreates the whole universe at each moment. The mother speaks of an experience which she says is one of the highest experiences, in which we find the whole universe recreated from moment to moment. It's as if at this moment the universe is created and it is extinguished and recreated now in the new step and the new step and the new step. And it is this unfolding which is the sense of time that we have. But if you observe, if you see the universe as being recreated at each moment, for the self to change things is as trivial as that. It just chooses in the next recreation to create as it wants, and you have the miracle. After all, it is recreating at each moment anyway. The sense of continuity is only the free choice of the self to maintain this pattern. And it can break the continuity, change anything freely. And so the character of this relationship of the self with the world is that it determines, but is not determined by its own determinations. And finally, the last relationship is enjoyment. The self enjoys the universe, but is not worked upon by its enjoyings. In our human world experience, when we enjoy something, we find that that which we enjoy changes us. A very crude example would be the food that you enjoy, and you pick the food that you enjoy the most and eat it with full enjoyment and eat a little more and a little more and a little more. The enjoyment does not grow, it diminishes. The more you eat, the less you seem to be able to enjoy it. And eventually a point comes where the whole thing changes and now you don't enjoy it anymore. It is even suffocating, it is in excess, and you want to puke. What happened is that in the very act of enjoying, you were modified. Your capacity to enjoy, therefore, modified, and the requirement for further enjoyment modified. So, after a while, I get sick of this food which I was enjoying so much, and I need something else to enjoy, which is what? Not eating, not drinking. I need a fast, and I go through a fast and enjoy the fast, after which again I get sick of that, and now I must start eating, and so on. The nature of the enjoyment binds us and then changes us. It changes us in the way, first by binding, because when we have enjoyed something once, it calls us back. We feel as if we must go back to it and enjoy it more. And the loss of that enjoyment is suddenly a trauma. The anticipation of a new enjoyment is now the enjoyment itself, and so on. There's a binding which takes place in the very act of enjoying, which modifies us. But for the self, this is not the case. What it enjoys, even as that changes, it continues to enjoy freely, because it stands back, supporting equally all its originations, all its instruments, all its determinations. It enjoys freely because all is itself. So these are the four relationships, and you will observe in ourselves, there are four statuses of the soul relationship with our nature, self with the world. There are the technical terms which are associated with each of these relationships. The first one we will say is the relationship of the creator. But the second one is using, where we have the term in Sanskrit, the Sakshi, who watches as a witness, but in the very act of watching, it as if influences, guides subtly. And then there is the term Anumanta, which is the sanctioner, and it chooses, is it accepts by conscious choice, and then it moves to the status of lordship. It becomes Ishvara. It determines, it compels, and in the status of lordship, it also enjoys. But these are all technical distinctions of status of the self, which are implied in each of these four relationships. You will see originate, use, determine, and enjoy. But through it all, the self remains always free. What that is, we cannot know unless we go behind the veil of our mental being, which knows only what is affected, what is determined, what is worked upon, what is changed. And this is the problem of the mental being. It can only know these changing processes. If it tries to find what is essential behind, it finds itself unable to. And the reason is very simple. He says, the mind can only be aware of that as something which we indefinably are, not as something which it definably knows. And the key word here is definably. What is it that we consider to be defined? For the mind, when do you say something is defined and something is not defined? The mind finds something defined when it is cut out and reduced and separated from the rest. When boundaries are created and limits are put, then I have defined it. Remove the boundaries, remove the limitations, and the whole shape becomes fluid, and you say, oh, this is not very defined. So a word is used in the vocabulary of a language. I have a sense of what the word means, but then I say, please define what you mean by this word. And when the person defines it, or when the dictionary defines it, it reduces the meaning to within fixed boundaries. And the moment the boundaries are set, I say, now I understand, now it is clear. So for the instrument of knowledge that we call mind, it is by reduction to limits, by freezing edges, borders, and cutting out to finite, set, fixed limits that we feel we have seized, we have grasped and known. But how do you reduce to finiteness and fixed limits that which is infinite, which is all potential, which is in fact everything that can be the self? You cannot. And so for the mind, the self necessarily is known as something indefinable. And it is known when we introspect as something, an identity which we feel indefinably we are. We are something, but I'm not able to quite express what it is that I feel. I'm not able to limit it. I'm not able to fix its borders. So this is the problem that happens when a finite piece, a drop of the ocean, wants to measure the immensity of the ocean. It comes close to it. It says, yes, this is similar to what I am. But then beyond that, I can't say anything more. And so when our awareness turns inwards and we go deep within, we feel, yes, we are in the presence of something which I am, which is true, which is real, which is immortal, which is infinite. But I don't know how to describe it. I don't know how to feel it. And as long as the mind tries to feel it and know it, it is unable to. And so there's always a transition in deep concentration or meditation where the mind has to be let go. The awareness with which we are pursuing the meditation itself is insufficient to know that which we seek to know. And it's as if the personal effort at that point has to lapse, and we have to open ourselves to that. And that comes forward, reveals itself, seizes us, and turns us into its nature. And then we experience an identity with it. That last step is where the effort has to cease, because the effort itself and the consciousness with which we are approaching is insufficient. You will find in all the traditions of the world which go deep enough in meditation, in attempt to realize the self or the absolute by whatever name they may give to it, they speak of the end of the effort and the stage where we have to give ourselves and surrender ourselves to that which we seek to know. And then the experience itself takes place in a consciousness other than our own. So he says, the mind can only be aware of that as something which we indefinably are, not as something which it definably knows. For the moment our mentality tries to fix this something, it loses itself in the flux and the movement, grasps at parts, functions, fictions, appearances, which it uses as planks of safety in the welter, or tries to cut out a form from the infinite and say, this is I. In the words of the Veda, when the mind approaches that and studies it, that vanishes. So we have the popular image which says you cannot grasp water. If you stick your hand in the water and try to grab it, it flows out through your fingers. You can only receive the water and hold it. But if you try to again grab what you have in your hand, again it leaks out. It's something like that. This is an analogy. But with the mind, the matter is even more complex. As you approach it, and the habit of the mind is to grasp and catch and cling and reduce, to define, it catches a part or a function, or it creates a fiction, an image of its own fantasy that it grasps. And whatever it has got, it holds and says, this is it, this is what I have got, this is the nature of the self. It is such that the symbolism is conveyed in the story of the seven wise men, seven blind men who try to describe the elephant. Each touches a part and thinks that is the whole. The elephant is too large, too different for the blind man to be able to reach out and identify with. So he can only grasp a piece and says, this is all that is. But in the very act of taking the ear or the tail or the trunk of the elephant, it has not got the elephant. It has got a trunk, but that is not elephant. The ear is not elephant, and so on. So that's a very deep, profound story. In fact, one could push the symbolism by asking, why do they say seven blind men or seven wise men? What are those seven parts that they are touching in the elephant? And there's a deep symbolism. Each represents an aspect of the self which the mind tends to grasp and reduce the self to. But we don't go into that symbol further. We just recognize that here, having caught some part, it grasps and holds that as the safety. When in the early stages of our meditation, we have a special experience, we tend to grasp at the form of that experience and are unable to hold the essence of it because the consciousness is still not inwardly cultured, trained to be able to deal with formless realities of pure consciousness. So we catch something. I felt happy, I felt good, I felt light, I felt as if I was floating, I felt bright, clear, fresh. Now you see, all of these terms which we use to describe that state are terms which could be had by other experiences of life. So when I say I felt light, I felt fresh, well, I feel light and I feel fresh when in the morning I have a breakfast of fruits. That's not the lightness I'm referring to. That's not the freshness. It was a different kind of freshness. What was it? I don't know. I can't describe it, but it was a freshness of a different type. It was a lightness of a different type. So we use this vocabulary, and that's all that we are able to retain. But we still know that that's not what we mean by it. There's something else which we find undescribable. Or when we are a little more trained, And we are now able to hold that experience, and even if we don't describe it, we are able to retain it and even retain it in memory in part. Then something else happens, or tries to cut out a form from the infinite and say, this is I. And this is a more subtle and more dangerous limitation. When the mind catches a high, deep spiritual experience, we say, I felt this immensity. That is self. Somebody else says, I felt this power. That is self. Somebody else says, I felt this ocean of light and enormous knowledge. That is self. Someone else says, was overwhelmed by a bliss. That was self. Someone else says, I ceased to exist. Nothing was. There was no space, no time. That is self. And so you will find many religions, philosophical, spiritual traditions, they come to some sense, some idea of the highest, and depending on what approach they had, they tend to reduce to that and say, this alone is. The others are wrong because what they describe is different. It is Sri Aurobindo alone who points out that all of these are facets of one, and the one is not known completely unless all these facets are experienced and the approach made to the absolute through each of these. So, an integral yoga, he says, not only has an integral method, not only has an integral experience and realization, but the approach itself must include all these facets. And until the divine is known through all these facets, he is not fully known. So, the mind's attempt to cut out a form from the infinite and say, this is I, is also a failure, although it may be a great experience and a great realization. That vanishes. But, Sri Aurobindo says, but behind the mind is this other, or Brahman consciousness. Mind of our mind, capital M, mind of our mind, sense of our senses, speech of our speech, life of our life. And now he's going back to the first verse of the Kena Upanishad, which asked these four questions, approaching through the mind, through the senses, through life, and through the creative word. What is it behind which makes these possible? And that in the next few verses of the Kena is elaborated in this second verse. That which is hearing of our hearing, mind of our mind, speech of our speech, that too is life of our life breath and sight of our sight. The wise are released beyond and they pass from this world and become immortal. So this is the line Sri Aurobindo is referring to. Behind the mind is this other, Brahman consciousness. Arriving at that, we arrive at self. We can draw back from mind the image into Brahman, the reality. Now, this describes in essence the nature of the experience as we thus introspect. It's as if we are disengaging from the surface phenomena, layer by layer, drawing back until at some point we even transcend the limitation of the mind. We go behind mind, and then we arrive at self, Brahman, the reality, of which we find mind is only an image. So this is now the experience to which we go to. And the key idea here is the sense of continuity. The Brahman not only transcends, but there is a continuity of the passage from our experience to that identity. And it is this which the Kena is also pointing to by asking these questions which link us. In the next paragraph, which we will take up only next time, Sri Aurobindo describes how we could describe that as not these things, but that's not enough. The Kena teaches us that that is the essence of these things. It is the absolute of these things, and there is a continuity, a linkage. And it is this which is being highlighted. And it is through this link and continuity that it is possible for us not only to realize that and be that, but being that and realizing that to live in the world. And as it does, to be able to originate the world, to be able to use these instruments of mind, life, and body, to be able to determine their actions, and to be able to truly enjoy from its freedom all of the universal life, not only the individual life. So, this will be the theme of the next few paragraphs, which we will take up in the session after 3 weeks. I will have to be out of station for the next 3 weeks. And for maintaining the continuity of our study, we will show some videos of some of the earlier talks or related things of your interest. But this we will continue on the 7th of June. We can reread this one line and then meditate on it for 2 minutes before we close. Verse 2. That which is hearing of our hearing, mind of our mind, speech of our speech, that too is life of our life breath and sight of our sight. The wise are released beyond and they pass from this world and become immortal. Verse 3. There sight travels not, nor speech, nor the mind. We know it not, nor can distinguish how one should teach of it, for it is other than the known. It is there, above the unknown. It is so we have heard from men of old who declared that to our understanding.